The phone call came at 6:47 in the morning, but Sarah Mitchell had already been awake for hours. She stood in the tiny bathroom of her one-bedroom apartment, staring at herself in the cracked mirror, practicing the smile she would need to wear for the next 12 hours. It was her birthday, her 26th, and she had exactly $14 in her bank account. "Happy birthday to me," she whispered, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the silence of the empty apartment. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that by the end of this day, her entire life would change forever, and it would all begin with a cup of coffee she couldn't afford to give away. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand how Sarah Mitchell ended up here, working double shifts at a roadside diner, wearing shoes with holes in the soles, choosing between paying for electricity and buying groceries. Because this story isn't just about what happened on that birthday. It's about everything that led to it, and the secret that a very powerful man had been keeping for 26 years. Sarah grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where front porches still meant something, and where dreams were things you read about in magazines, not things you actually chased. Her mother, Linda Mitchell, had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the neighboring town. She would leave before sunrise and come home after dark, her hands cracked and red from cleaning products, her back aching from scrubbing floors. But she never complained, not once. Instead, she would sit at the kitchen table with young Sarah and tell her stories. "Someday," Linda would say, smoothing Sarah's hair, "you're going to do something amazing. You're going to help people just like your grandmother did, just like I try to do. That's what the Mitchell women do. We help." Sarah believed her. She believed every word. But life has a way of testing the things we believe in. When Sarah was 17, her mother got sick. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then turned into something the doctors said they'd caught too late. The medical bills piled up like snowdrifts, first thousands, then tens of thousands, then amounts that made Sarah dizzy to think about. Linda Mitchell passed away 3 weeks before Sarah's 18th birthday. She left behind a daughter with no other family, a mountain of debt, and a handwritten note that Sarah still carried in her wallet to this day. Be kind even when it costs you everything. That's the only thing that matters in the end. Those words had shaped every decision Sarah made for the next 8 years. They were the reason she gave her last $5 to a homeless woman outside the grocery store. They were the reason she stayed late to help co-workers, even when she was exhausted. They were the reason she had ended up here, at the Riverside Diner, making minimum wage plus tips that barely covered her rent. But they were also the reason she had never given up hope. Because her mother had been kind, impossibly kind, and Sarah believed, she had to believe, that kindness meant something, that it mattered, that somehow, somewhere, it would come back. She just didn't know it would come back in the form of a trembling old man who couldn't pay for his coffee. The Riverside Diner sat at the edge of town, where the highway met the old country road. It was the kind of place truckers stopped for breakfast and families stopped for dinner on their way somewhere else. The vinyl booths were cracked, the floor tiles were chipped, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, which was exactly what the regulars loved about it. Sarah had been working there for 3 years. She knew every regular by name, knew who took their eggs scrambled and who took them over easy, knew who was going through a divorce and who had just gotten a new grandchild. She remembered birthdays and anniversaries, asked about sick relatives, and always had a genuine smile ready. "You're too good for this place," her co-worker Maria would tell her at least once a week. "You should be running a charity or something, not refilling coffee cups for people who leave $2 tips." But Sarah would just shake her head. "Every job matters. Every person matters. My mom used to say that." On the morning of her birthday, Sarah arrived at the diner at 6:30 a.m., even though her shift didn't start until 7. She wanted to make sure everything was ready, that the salt shakers were full, and the menus were wiped down. It was a habit she had developed early, showing up before she was expected, staying after she was needed. The morning rush came and went like it always did. Truckers, early commuters, the retired men who gathered in the corner booth to argue about politics and sports. Sarah moved between tables like she was dancing, her notepad in one hand and a coffee pot in the other, her smile never faltering. By 10 a.m., the diner had emptied out, leaving only a few scattered customers. Sarah was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up and saw him. The old man was at least 80 years old, maybe older. He walked with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a wooden cane that looked like it had seen better days. His clothes were clean but worn, a faded plaid shirt buttoned all the way to his neck, trousers that were too big for his thin frame, shoes that were polished but cracked at the seams. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They were the palest blue she had ever seen, almost silver in the morning light, and they held a deep, aching sadness that made her heart clench. He looked around the diner with an expression that was part confusion, part hope, like he was searching for something or someone he wasn't sure he would find. "Good morning," Sarah called out, her voice warm. "Sit anywhere you'd like. I'll be right with you." The old man looked at her for a long moment, something flickering behind those pale eyes. Then he nodded slowly and made his way to a booth by the window, his cane tapping against the floor with each step. Sarah grabbed a menu and a glass of water, then walked over to his table. Up close she could see the map of wrinkles on his face, the liver spots on his trembling hands, the slight yellowing of his collar that suggested he had been wearing this shirt for several days. "Welcome to Riverside Diner," she said, setting down the water. "Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" The old man looked up at her, and for a moment his eyes seemed to search her face, like he was looking for something specific. Then he cleared his throat. "Just coffee," he said, his voice hoarse and thin. "Just a cup of coffee, please." "Coming right up." When Sarah returned with the coffee, she noticed that the old man hadn't touched the menu. He was just sitting there, staring out the window at the parking lot, his hands wrapped around himself like he was cold, even though the diner was warm. "Are you sure I can't get you anything to eat?" she asked gently. "Our pancakes are pretty famous, best in 3 counties or so, I'm told." The old man shook his head without looking at her. "No, thank you, just the coffee." Something about the way he said it, the slight catch in his voice, the way his shoulders hunched, told Sarah everything she needed to know. He wasn't just being modest. He couldn't afford anything else. She had seen this before, more times than she wanted to count. People who came in with just enough change for a cup of coffee, who sat in the warmth for as long as they could before going back out into the world. People who were one paycheck, one emergency, one piece of bad luck away from having nothing at all. "Take your time," she said softly. "No rush at all." She went back to her work, but she kept an eye on the old man. He sat there for almost an hour, nursing that single cup of coffee, occasionally lifting it to his lips with hands that shook so badly she was afraid he would spill it. He never asked for a refill. He never asked for anything. At 11:15, the old man slowly pushed himself out of the booth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of change, pennies, nickels, a few dimes, and began counting it on the table, his lips moving silently. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her heart sinking. She knew what was happening. She had seen that desperate counting too many times before. The old man's face fell. He recounted the change, then counted it again, but the result was the same. He was short. He was always going to be short. He looked up, and their eyes met across the diner. In that moment, Sarah saw something she recognized all too well: shame. The deep, crushing shame of not having enough, of being a burden, of being less than. She had felt that shame herself, more times than she could count. Every time she had to return groceries at the checkout because her card was declined. Every time she had to call her landlord and beg for an extension. Every time she had to choose between medicine and food, heat and transportation, survival and dignity. The old man began gathering his change, his movements slow and defeated. He was going to leave without paying, Sarah realized. He was going to slip out the door and carry that shame with him like a stone around his neck. Not on my watch, she thought. She walked over to his table before he could stand. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice light and casual, "I think there's been a mistake. Your coffee is on the house today." The old man looked up at her, confusion and suspicion mixing in his pale eyes. "What?" "It's a promotion," Sarah lied smoothly. "Every 10th customer gets a free coffee. You're number 10 today. Congratulations." It was the most transparent lie she had ever told, and they both knew it. There was no promotion. There had never been a promotion. The coffee would come out of Sarah's tips she desperately needed for her own survival, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the look on the old man's face, the way the shame slowly drained away, replaced by something that might have been gratitude or relief, or maybe just the simple human dignity of not being pitied. The old man's voice cracked. He looked down at the change in his hand, then back up at Sarah. Thank you so much." "You're welcome," Sarah said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Have a wonderful day, sir, and come back any time." The old man nodded slowly, pocketing his change with trembling hands. Then he did something that surprised her. He reached out and gently took her hand, holding it for just a moment. "You're a good person," he said quietly. "Your mother would be proud." Jean le dum. Before Sarah could ask how he knew about her mother, before she could process the strangeness of that comment, the old man turned and walked out of the diner, his cane tapping against the floor, his shoulders just slightly less hunched than they had been before. Sarah stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Something about that encounter had felt important, significant, like the universe had arranged it specifically for her, or for him, or for both of them. But she didn't have time to think about it. The lunch rush was starting, and she had tables to serve. She didn't notice the black luxury sedan parked across the street. She didn't notice the man sitting inside it, watching her through tinted windows. And she certainly didn't notice the way that man's hands were gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes never leaving the door through which the old man had just disappeared. The man in the sedan was named William Harrison, and he was worth approximately $4.7 billion. He was 62 years old, with silver hair that he kept meticulously trimmed, a face that had graced the covers of Forbes and Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, and a reputation as one of the most ruthless businessmen in the country. He had built his empire from nothing, or so the stories went, through a combination of brilliant instincts, iron will, and a complete unwillingness to let anyone stand in his way. His companies employed over 40,000 people. His charitable foundation had donated hundreds of millions to hospitals, schools, and research institutions. His name was on buildings, scholarships, and awards across 3 continents. But William Harrison had a secret he had kept for 26 years, a secret that had brought him to this small town, to this roadside diner, to this moment. The old man who had just walked out of that diner was his father. And the young waitress who had paid for his coffee was the daughter he had never known existed. William's hands were still shaking as he watched his father walk across the parking lot toward the bus stop. The sight of him, so old, so frail, so diminished from the towering figure of William's childhood, was almost more than he could bear. They hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since the day William's father had discovered something William had done, something unforgivable, and had walked out of William's mansion without looking back. "You've become everything I raised you not to be," his father had said that day, his voice not angry but sad, infinitely, devastatingly sad. "You've forgotten what matters." William had told himself that his father was wrong, that building an empire was what mattered, that success was what mattered, that winning was what mattered. But now, watching his father limp toward a bus stop with only pocket change to his name, watching a young waitress show more compassion in 30 seconds than William had shown in 30 years, he wasn't so sure. He had come to this town for a reason. Several private investigators and 6 months of searching had led him here, to a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who worked at the Riverside Diner and lived alone in a small apartment on the other side of town. Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of Linda Mitchell, the granddaughter of... William couldn't finish the thought. It was too much, too complicated, too tangled in secrets and lies and choices he had made when he was young and foolish and convinced that money could solve everything. He had planned to approach her today, to introduce himself, explain everything, and offer her the life she deserved. He had a speech prepared, a legal team on standby, and a trust fund already set up in her name. But then he had seen his father walk into the diner, and he had watched through the window as Sarah, his daughter, though she didn't know it, had paid for his father's coffee with money she clearly didn't have. He had seen her smile at him, genuine and warm, not the practiced smile of someone working for tips, but the real smile of someone who cared. He had seen her reach out and take his father's hand, and in that moment William Harrison, the man who had everything, realized that he had nothing. Nothing that mattered anyway. His daughter had inherited something more valuable than any fortune he could offer. She had inherited her mother's heart, and her grandmother's, and her great-grandmother's before that. The Mitchell women who helped. William's eyes burned as he watched his father sit down at the bus stop, alone and fragile, and waiting for a bus that might or might not come. He wanted to get out of the car. He wanted to run to him, embrace him, beg for forgiveness. But he couldn't, not yet, not until he understood something first. He needed to see more. He needed to know if Sarah Mitchell was truly as good as she appeared, or if he was just seeing what he wanted to see. So he stayed in his car, and he watched, and he waited. The lunch rush hit hard, and Sarah barely had time to think about the old man or his strange comment about her mother. She moved from table to table on autopilot, taking orders, delivering food, refilling drinks, and cleaning up messes. By 2 p.m. she was exhausted. Her feet ached, her back hurt, and she had spilled ranch dressing on her only clean apron. But she kept smiling. She always kept smiling. "Hey, Sarah," Maria called from behind the counter. "You've got a phone call." Sarah frowned. Nobody ever called her at work. She didn't really have anyone who would call her anywhere. She picked up the phone in the back office. "Hello? Hi, is this Sarah Mitchell?" It was a woman's voice, professional and slightly nervous. "Yes, this is Sarah." "Hi, Sarah. This is Jennifer from Rosewood Bakery. I'm calling about the birthday cake you ordered for today's pickup." Sarah's heart skipped. The birthday cake. She had almost forgotten. She had placed the order 3 weeks ago, when she had still been hopeful about picking up extra shifts, when she had still believed she might be able to give herself one small treat for her birthday. But then her hours had been cut, and her electricity bill had been higher than expected, and her rent was due in 3 days, and now she had $14 in her account and a credit card that was already maxed out. "Yes," Sarah said slowly. "What about it?" "Well, I just wanted to confirm your pickup time. You said you'd be here at 4 p.m.? Sarah closed her eyes. The cake was $27. $27 she didn't have. $27, that meant the difference between paying her electricity bill on time and getting a late fee she couldn't afford. She thought about her mother, about birthday mornings in their tiny kitchen, where Linda would somehow manage to produce a small cake with a single candle, no matter how tight money was. "It's important to celebrate," her mother would say, "even when things are hard. Especially when things are hard." But her mother wasn't here anymore, and Sarah was alone. And sometimes, when you were alone, you had to make choices that broke your heart. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice steady even though something inside her was crumbling, "I need to cancel the order." There was a pause. "Oh, are you sure? It's already been decorated. We wrote 'Happy Birthday, Sarah' on it, just like you asked." Sarah swallowed hard. "I'm sure. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "It's no trouble at all. We can put it in our display case. Maybe someone will buy it. These things happen. I hope you have a happy birthday anyway, Sarah." "Thank you," Sarah whispered, and hung up the phone. She stood there for a long moment, alone in the cramped back office, surrounded by boxes of supplies and the smell of cooking grease. It was her birthday. She was 26 years old. She was alone, broke, and she had just canceled her own birthday cake. A single tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, took a deep breath, and walked back out to the dining room. There were tables to serve, people to help, work to do. The pity party could wait. William Harrison watched through the diner window as Sarah emerged from the back, her smile firmly in place, even though, he could tell somehow, her eyes looked dimmer than before. He didn't know what had happened in that back office, but he could guess. One of his assistants had done some digging before he came here. He knew about Sarah's financial situation. He knew about her mother's medical bills, which Sarah had been slowly paying off for years, even though she technically wasn't required to. He knew about the apartment with the broken heater and the car that barely ran. He knew about the double shifts and the skip meals and the second-hand clothes. He knew his daughter was struggling, and he knew he was partly responsible. 27 years ago, William Harrison had been a very different man. He had been 35, hungry, ambitious, and utterly convinced that he was destined for greatness. He had just started his first company, and he was working 100-hour weeks, sacrificing everything, relationships, health, morality, on the altar of success. That was when he met Linda Mitchell. She was a housekeeper at a hotel where he was staying during a business trip. She was 22, beautiful in an unassuming way, and kind in a way that made William uncomfortable. She didn't seem impressed by his expensive suits or his big plans. She just smiled at him, asked him how his day was, and actually listened to his answer. For 3 weeks, they talked every day, and by the end of those 3 weeks, William had fallen in love with her. But William Harrison didn't believe in love. He believed in strategy, in advancement, in the careful calculation of risks and rewards. And Linda Mitchell, for all her virtues, was a risk he couldn't afford. She was poor, she was uneducated, she would be a liability, a distraction, a weight around his neck as he climbed toward the heights he knew he was meant to reach. So when those 3 weeks ended, William left without saying goodbye. He never knew that Linda was pregnant. He never knew that 9 months later, a baby girl was born, a girl with his eyes and her mother's heart. He never knew that Linda raised that girl alone, working 2 and 3 jobs, sacrificing everything so her daughter could have a better life. And he never knew that Linda kept a photograph of him in a drawer, never showing it to Sarah, never explaining, never blaming, just keeping it, just in case. William had found the photograph 7 months ago after Linda's death, when his investigators had finally pieced together the truth. They had found it among her possessions, tucked into a Bible, with a single word written on the back in Linda's handwriting. Sarah's. That was when William had realized what he had done, what he had lost, what he could never, ever get back. The afternoon crawled by. Sarah served table after table, her smile never wavering, her kindness never dimming. William watched her help a young mother with 2 screaming toddlers, bringing extra napkins without being asked, and making funny faces at the children until they laughed. He watched her sit with an elderly woman who ate alone, keeping her company for a few extra minutes, even though other tables needed attention. He watched her overtip the busboy, who was new and nervous, slipping him a $5 bill from her own tips, with a whispered word of encouragement. Everything he saw confirmed what he had suspected. Sarah Mitchell was exactly what she appeared to be, a genuinely good person, struggling against circumstances beyond her control, giving more than she received because that was simply who she was, She was her mother's daughter, and she was his daughter too, though she had clearly inherited nothing from him except perhaps the stubborn determination that kept her going when anyone else would have given up. At 3:45 p.m., William made a decision. He wasn't going to approach her, not yet. He needed to do something first, something that would show her and himself that he was capable of being the father she deserved. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Jennifer, this is William Harrison. I need you to do something for me. It's about a birthday cake." Sarah's shift ended at 4 p.m. She changed out of her apron, counted her tips, $47, not great, but not terrible, and walked out to the parking lot. Her car, a 15-year-old sedan with rust spots and a temperamental engine, was waiting for her in the far corner of the lot. She had parked it there because she was embarrassed by how it looked next to the newer cars, a habit she had developed years ago and never quite shaken. She was almost to her car when she noticed someone standing beside it. It was the old man from this morning, the one with the pale eyes and the trembling hands, the one whose coffee she had paid for. "Sir?" Sarah stopped a few feet away, surprised and slightly concerned. "Is everything okay?" The old man looked at her with those strange, searching eyes. Up close, in the afternoon light, she could see something in them that she hadn't noticed before, a deep, profound regret. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice stronger than it had been that morning. "For what you did." Sarah shook her head. "It was just a cup of coffee. It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing." The old man took a step toward her. "It was everything. You don't know what it meant to me. To be treated like a person, to be shown kindness when I didn't deserve it." "Everyone deserves kindness," Sarah said automatically. It was something her mother used to say, something she had always believed. The old man smiled, and for a moment he looked years younger. "Your mother raised you well." There it was again, that comment about her mother. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "How do you know about my mother?" she asked quietly. The old man was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I knew her, a long time ago, before you were born." Sarah's world tilted. She reached out and grabbed the side of her car to steady herself. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" Before the old man could answer, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. It was the same car that had been parked across the street all day, though Sarah hadn't noticed it. The car came to a stop a few feet away, and the driver's door opened. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and a face that spoke of power and authority, but his eyes were the same pale blue as the old man's, the same pale blue as Sarah's own. "Dad," the tall man said, his voice cracking on that single word. "What are you doing?" The old man turned to face his son. "What you were too afraid to do, William. I'm telling her the truth." Sarah looked between them, her mind reeling. "Dad." "William." The expensive car, the matching eyes. "What truth?" she demanded. "What's going on? Who are you people?" William Harrison took a deep breath. Then he walked toward her slowly, like he was approaching a wounded animal, like he was afraid she might bolt at any moment. "My name is William Harrison," he said, "and 27 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I left your mother before I knew she was pregnant with you, before I knew you existed." His voice broke. "I'm your father, Sarah, and I've been looking for you for 7 months." The world went silent. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she was hearing. Her father was alive. Her father was a billionaire. Her father was standing in front of her in a roadside diner parking lot on her 26th birthday. "No," she said, the word coming out strangled. "No, that's not possible. My mother said she didn't know who." "She was protecting you," the old man said gently. "Linda never wanted you to grow up feeling unwanted. She knew William had left, And she didn't want you to spend your life wondering why. How do you know my mother? Sarah whirled to face the old man. Who are you? I'm Thomas Harrison, William's father. The old man's eyes filled with tears. And your grandfather. Sarah's legs gave out. She would have fallen if William hadn't caught her, his arms surprisingly strong for a man who looked like he spent his life behind a desk. I'm sorry, William was saying over and over, like a broken record. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Sarah pushed him away, stumbling back until she hit her car. You left her. You left my mother. Yes? William didn't try to make excuses. I was young and stupid and obsessed with building my company. I thought love was a weakness. I thought she would hold me back. His voice cracked again. I was wrong. I was so wrong. She worked herself to the bone, Sarah said, her voice rising. She cleaned houses for people like you. She scrubbed your toilets and washed your sheets and came home so tired she could barely stand. And the whole time you were out there building your empire, never knowing, never caring. I didn't know, William said desperately. Sarah, please. I didn't know about you until 7 months ago. After your mother, after she passed. I've been searching for you ever since. Why? Sarah laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. Why now? What do you want from me? Nothing. William held up his hands. I don't want anything from you. I wanted to meet you, to know you, to try to make up for everything I should have been there for. You can't make up for it. Sarah's eyes were burning with tears she refused to let fall. You can't write a check and fix 26 years of my mother working herself into an early grave. You can't buy back the birthdays she couldn't afford to celebrate, or the dreams she had to give up, or the life she should have had. I know. William's voice was barely audible. I know I can't, but I still have to try. Because you're my daughter. And whether you want me in your life or not, you deserve to know the truth. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the expensive suit and the silver hair and the powerful presence, but she also saw the fear in his eyes, the desperate hope, the aching regret. He was a stranger who had abandoned her mother and spent his life accumulating wealth while Sarah grew up poor, a stranger who had shown up 26 years too late. But he was also her father. The answer to a question she had asked herself every night as a child, lying in bed wondering why she didn't have a daddy like the other kids. I paid for that man's coffee, Sarah said suddenly, pointing at Thomas. This morning, I thought he was just some homeless guy who couldn't afford his bill. Thomas smiled sadly. I know. I saw. That's why I'm here. It was a test? Sarah's voice sharpened. No, Thomas said firmly. It wasn't a test. I really couldn't afford the coffee. William has been estranged from me for 15 years because I confronted him about the kind of man he was becoming. I left his house that day with nothing but the clothes on my back, and I never asked for a penny of his money. He looked at his son with an expression that mixed love and disappointment in equal measure. I've been living on Social Security and odd jobs ever since. Sarah looked between them, trying to understand the complicated dynamics at play. A billionaire father who had abandoned his own father over a moral disagreement. A grandfather who had chosen poverty over compromise. A mother who had never spoken ill of anyone, even the man who left her pregnant and alone. And in the middle of it all herself, a woman who had inherited her mother's kindness, her grandfather's principles, and apparently nothing at all from the father who stood before her now. What do you want? She asked again, but this time her voice was tired rather than angry. William reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I know this won't fix anything, but your mother left behind medical bills that you've been paying off for years. I've paid them, all of them. The debt is gone. Sarah stared at the envelope. What? And I've set up a trust fund in your name. It's enough to live on comfortably for the rest of your life. You never have to work another double shift again. I don't want your money. The words came out automatically, even though part of her, the part that was tired and hungry, and had just canceled her own birthday cake, screamed at her to take it. I know you don't. William nodded like he had expected this response. "That's one of the reasons I know you're your mother's daughter. But please, just think about it, not for me, for yourself. You deserve a chance to pursue your dreams instead of just surviving." Sarah was about to respond when another car pulled into the parking lot. It was a delivery van, white with a colorful logo on the side. Rosewood Bakery. A young woman hopped out of the van, carrying a pink box that Sarah recognized immediately. "Sarah Mitchell," the woman called out, "I have a delivery for you." Sarah's heart clenched. I canceled that order." "I know," the woman said with a smile. "But someone else purchased it and asked us to deliver it to you here, with an extra note." She handed Sarah the box and a small card, then hopped back in her van and drove away. Sarah looked down at the card. It was handwritten in a script she didn't recognize. "Happy 26th birthday, Sarah. I know I wasn't there for the first 25. I'd like to be there for the next 26, if you'll let me. Your father." She opened the box. Inside was the cake she had ordered. A simple white cake with pink flowers and "Happy Birthday, Sarah," written in elegant script. But there was something else, too. Nestled next to the cake was a small velvet box. Her hands shaking, Sarah opened it. Inside was a ring, an antique ring with a delicate gold band and a small diamond that sparkled in the afternoon light. It was clearly old, decades old at least, and clearly valuable. "That was your grandmother's," Thomas said softly. "My wife's. She passed away when William was just a boy, but she would have loved you. She had the same kind heart you have, the same beautiful spirit." Sarah couldn't speak. She just stood there, holding the ring, looking at the cake, surrounded by the two men who represented everything she had never known about herself. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "You don't have to say anything," William said. "Not today. Take as much time as you need. I'll be staying in town for a while. If you want to talk, if you have questions, I'll be here." He reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder, a tentative gesture, asking for permission rather than assuming it. "Happy birthday, Sarah," he said. I hope it can still be a happy one." That night, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, eating birthday cake straight from the box and staring at her grandmother's ring. Her phone sat beside her, filled with missed calls from William's assistant, offering everything from new apartments to new cars to full-ride scholarships for any school she wanted to attend. She hadn't answered any of them. She was thinking about her mother, about all the nights Linda had worked overtime so Sarah could have new shoes for school, about all the birthday cakes she had somehow managed to produce, no matter how tight money was, about the smile that never faded, even when the bills piled up and the creditors called and the world seemed determined to crush her. Linda Mitchell had raised her daughter to be kind, to help others, to see the humanity in everyone, even those who seemed undeserving. Could she extend that same grace to the man who had abandoned her mother? Could she forgive a lifetime of absence for the sake of a future she had never imagined? Could she learn to love a father she had never known? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, and she had no answers. But for now, on this strange and overwhelming birthday, she had cake. She had a ring that connected her to a grandmother she would never meet, and she had something she hadn't had in a very long time. She had hope. 3 weeks later, Sarah met William for coffee. It wasn't at the Riverside Diner. That felt too complicated, too loaded with memories of that first strange day. Instead, they met at a quiet cafe across town, a neutral space where they could talk without interruption. William arrived early, of course. He was pacing outside when Sarah pulled up in her old car, looking more nervous than any billionaire had a right to look. "Thank you for coming," he said as she approached. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Sarah admitted, "but I had some questions, and I figured you deserved the chance to answer them." They went inside, ordered coffee, and found a table in the corner. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "Why did you leave her?" Sarah finally asked. The real reason, not the sanitized version. William wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, staring down at the dark liquid. I was afraid, he said quietly. I grew up poor, you know. My father worked in a factory and my mother cleaned houses, just like your mother did. I swore I would never live like that. I swore I would make something of myself, no matter what it cost. He looked up at her, his pale eyes haunted. When I met your mother, I was just starting to succeed. I had my first company, my first investors, my first real chance at the life I had always wanted. And Linda made me feel things I wasn't prepared to feel. She made me want to slow down, to appreciate what I had instead of always chasing more. She made me want to be a different kind of man. That doesn't sound like a bad thing. It wasn't, but I was too stupid to see that. William shook his head. I convinced myself that she was a distraction, that if I stayed with her, I would lose my drive, my ambition, my hunger. I told myself that I could find love later, after I had built my empire, after I had proven myself. And did you? Sarah asked. Find love later? I got married twice, both times to women who were appropriate, wealthy, connected, impressive on paper. William's voice was bitter. Neither marriage lasted more than 5 years. Neither one ever made me feel the way your mother did in those 3 weeks we had together. Sarah absorbed this. It didn't make anything okay, but it helped her understand. What about Thomas? She asked. Why did you stop speaking to your own father? William's face tightened. Because he saw what I was becoming, and he tried to stop me. 15 years ago, I was involved in a business deal that would have made me billions, but it would have destroyed thousands of jobs in the process. People would have lost their homes, their livelihoods, everything, and I didn't care. I told myself it was just business. He paused, collecting himself. My father came to my office and begged me not to do it. He said my mother would be ashamed of me. He said I had become the kind of man we used to despise, wealthy, heartless, treating people like numbers on a spreadsheet. What did you do? I did the deal anyway. William's voice was barely audible. And I told my father that if he didn't approve of my choices, he was welcome to leave and never come back. He left. He left. And I didn't hear from him for 15 years. I didn't even know where he was until a few months ago when I started looking for you and realized he had been living just a few miles away this whole time, living in poverty because he was too proud to take money from a son he was ashamed of. Sarah sat with this for a moment. The picture that was forming was complex. A man who had made terrible choices, who had hurt the people who loved him most, but who seemed to genuinely regret those choices now. Why did you start looking for me? She asked. William reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. He slid it across the table. It was a picture of a young woman, early 20s, with dark hair and a shy smile. She was standing in what looked like a hotel lobby, wearing a maid's uniform, looking at the camera with an expression of pure, unguarded happiness. That's your mother, William said. I found this among her things after she passed. There was a note on the back. Sarah turned the photograph over. There, in her mother's handwriting, were 2 words. Remember kindness. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if she meant it for me or for herself, William said. But when I found it, I understood what I had lost, what I had thrown away, and I knew I had to find you, not to assuage my guilt. Nothing can do that. But because you deserved to know the truth, and because I hoped I might have a chance to be part of your life, whatever that looks like. Sarah looked at the photograph of her mother for a long time. Then she looked at the man sitting across from her, the man who had caused so much pain, but who also seemed to be trying, genuinely trying, to make amends. I'm not going to pretend everything is okay, she said finally. It's not. You missed 26 years. You hurt my mother. You hurt Thomas. You can't just write a check and make that disappear. I know. But, Sarah took a deep breath. My mother taught me that people can change. She believed in second chances. And I think she would want me to at least try. William's eyes widened with hope. What does that mean? It means we can start slow, Coffee, like this. Getting to know each other. I'm not promising anything, but I'm willing to try. For the first time since she had met him, William Harrison smiled, really smiled with his whole face, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "That's all I could ever ask for." Over the next several months, Sarah's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. She didn't accept the trust fund, not right away. Instead, she asked William to use the money to start a foundation in her mother's name. The Linda Mitchell Foundation would help single mothers and their children, providing resources for education, health care, and economic stability. It would be the legacy her mother deserved. But she did accept some help. She let William pay off the remaining medical bills. She let him buy her a reliable car when her old one finally gave up completely. She let him invest in her dream, a small cafe of her own, a place where everyone was welcome, where meals were shared and stories were told, and kindness was the currency that mattered most. "Your mother would be proud," Thomas told her on opening day, as she hung a photograph of Linda behind the counter. "She would be so proud." Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. "I hope so." The cafe was called Mitchell's, a simple name for a simple dream, but the word had spread about the woman who ran it, the woman who never turned anyone away, who offered free meals to those who couldn't pay, and free advice to those who needed it. Within a year, Mitchell's had become a beloved institution in the small town, a gathering place for people from all walks of life. And every day, without fail, Sarah made sure there was fresh coffee available for anyone who needed it, free of charge, no questions asked. "Every 10th customer gets a free coffee," she would joke when newcomers asked about it. "It's a promotion." Everyone knew there was no promotion. Everyone knew she was paying out of her own pocket, but nobody said anything. They just smiled and drank their coffee and felt a little more hopeful about the world. On Sarah's 27th birthday, her cafe was packed. The regulars were there, of course, the truckers and the families and the retired men who had migrated from the Riverside Diner to this new establishment. But there were new faces, too. People from neighboring towns who had heard about Mitchell's and wanted to see it for themselves. People who had benefited from the Linda Mitchell Foundation and wanted to thank Sarah in person. And at the corner table, sitting side by side in a way they hadn't done in 15 years, were William and Thomas Harrison. They had reconciled slowly, painfully, through the unlikely bridge that Sarah had built between them. Thomas had forgiven his son, not all at once, but in increments, as William demonstrated through his actions that he was truly trying to change. They would never get back the years they had lost, but they could try to make the most of the years they had left. "Speech," someone shouted as Sarah emerged from the kitchen, carrying her own birthday cake, a towering chocolate confection that Maria, now her head baker, had made especially for the occasion. "No speeches," Sarah laughed. "I hate speeches, you know that." But as she set the cake down and looked around at all the people who had come to celebrate with her, she felt something welling up inside her that demanded to be expressed. "Okay, fine," she said, holding up her hands for quiet. "One small thing." The room fell silent. "A year ago, I was working at a diner across town, barely making ends meet, wondering if my life would ever amount to anything. I had given up on my dreams. I had given up on finding family. I had almost given up on believing that kindness mattered." She paused, looking at William and Thomas in the corner. "And then something happened, a small thing, just a cup of coffee that I paid for because a stranger couldn't afford it. I didn't think about it. I just did it, because that's what my mother taught me to do. That's what all the Mitchell women have always done." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I didn't know it at the time, but that small act of kindness set off a chain of events that changed everything. It brought my father back into my life. It reunited a family that had been broken for years. It opened doors I didn't even know existed." She looked around the room at all the faces watching her, old friends and new, family both biological and chosen. "I guess what I'm trying to say is Kindness matters, even when it costs you something, even when no one is watching, even when it seems like the world is too broken to be fixed. One small act of kindness can change everything. My mother knew that, and now I know it too. She lifted her coffee cup in a toast. To my mother, Linda Mitchell, to kindness. And to all of you, for being here to celebrate with me, thank you. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Someone started singing "Happy Birthday," and soon the whole cafe had joined in, their voices rising together in a jubilant chorus. As Sarah blew out the candles on her cake, she made a wish, not for herself, she had everything she needed, but for the world, for every struggling waitress working double shifts, for every tired mother cleaning houses, for every lonely old man who couldn't afford his coffee. She wished for kindness to spread, for people to help each other, for the Mitchell legacy to live on. And as she opened her eyes and saw her father smiling at her, her grandfather wiping away tears, and a room full of people who had come to celebrate a woman who gave more than she received, she knew somehow that her wish was already coming true. William Harrison went on to become one of the most generous philanthropists in the country. He stepped back from his business empire and devoted himself entirely to charitable work, using his fortune to help those who had been left behind by a system that rewarded wealth over kindness. He never tried to buy Sarah's love. He earned it slowly through years of small gestures and genuine effort, through showing up when he said he would and listening when she needed to talk. He learned to be the father he should have been all along. Not perfect, never perfect, but present and trying. Thomas Harrison lived another 6 years, long enough to see his granddaughter's cafe expand into a chain of community restaurants across the state, each one operating on the same principle. Everyone was welcome, and no one was turned away. He spent his final years surrounded by family, the son he had reconciled with, the granddaughter he had never known, and a community that had embraced him as one of their own. When he passed peacefully in his sleep, he was holding the photograph of his wife that he had carried with him for decades. And Sarah Mitchell, the kind waitress who had once paid for an old man's coffee with money she couldn't afford to spend, became something she had never imagined she could be, not a billionaire. She had no interest in accumulating wealth, not famous. She shied away from the spotlight whenever possible. What she became was something simpler and more profound. She became a symbol, a living reminder that kindness matters, that small gestures can change lives, that the chains of family once broken can sometimes be mended. And every year, on her birthday, she would stand behind the counter of her cafe and offer free coffee to every customer who walked through the door. "It's a promotion," she would say with a smile. And everyone would smile back, because everyone knew the truth. It wasn't a promotion, it was a legacy. It was the Mitchell way. In the years that followed, the story of Sarah Mitchell spread far beyond the small town where it began. It was shared on social media, told in church sermons, used as an example in business schools studying ethical leadership. But Sarah never let the attention change her. She kept working at her cafe, kept serving coffee, kept helping anyone who walked through her door with a need she could meet. "Don't you ever get tired?" a young reporter asked her once, during an interview that Sarah had reluctantly agreed to. "Don't you ever want to stop giving?" Sarah thought about the question for a long moment. She thought about her mother, working until her hands cracked and her back gave out. She thought about her grandfather, choosing poverty over compromise. She thought about all the people who had come into her life because of one small act of kindness. And then she smiled. "My mother used to say that giving is like breathing," she said. "You don't get tired of it. You can't stop doing it. It's just what keeps you alive." The reporter nodded, scribbling in her notebook. "One more question," she said. "If you could go back to that day, the day you paid for that old man's coffee, knowing everything that would happen next, would you do it again?" Sarah didn't hesitate. Every single time, she said. Every single time. Tia, and so ends the story of Sarah Mitchell, the kind waitress who paid an old man's coffee and discovered a family she never knew she had. It's a story about kindness and how it can ripple outward in ways we never expect. It's a story about forgiveness and how even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. It's a story about family and how the bonds between us are never truly broken, only waiting to be restored. But most of all, it's a story about hope. The hope that lives in every small act of generosity, every moment of compassion, every choice to see the humanity in a stranger. Because the truth is, we never know who's watching. We never know whose life we might change. We never know what doors we might open with a simple gesture of kindness. So the next time you see someone struggling, an old man who can't afford his coffee, a mother juggling too many burdens, a stranger who looks like they need a friend, remember Sarah Mitchell. Remember what her mother taught her. Remember that kindness always matters. And remember that sometimes, just sometimes, a single cup of coffee can change everything. Be kind, even when it costs you everything. That's the only thing that matters in the end. Linda Mitchell.